The Chinese government just placed one of the biggest bets in the history of city planning, something close to $232 billion, aimed at solving a problem most people outside the field have never even heard of. The problem is simple to state. Every time it rains hard on a modern city, the water has nowhere to go. Concrete and asphalt cover almost every surface, so instead of soaking into the ground the way it would on open land, rain just runs off instead. It floods streets, backs up into subways, and overwhelms drains built for a gentler world. This isn't a uniquely Chinese problem either. It's the default outcome of building any city the way most of the world has built cities for the last 100 years, and China simply has more cities, more people, and more rainfall to contend with than almost anywhere else. China's answer wasn't to build bigger pipes. It was to make the city itself act like a sponge. Picture a parking lot that lets rain sink straight through it instead of pooling on top, the same way water disappears into a bath mat instead of sitting on tile. Now picture that idea applied across roads, rooftops, parks, and entire riverbanks in dozens of cities at once. Permeable pavement that drinks water instead of shedding it. Rooftops planted with soil and grass instead of bare tile. Wetlands and ponds built back into neighborhoods that paved over them decades ago. Streets redesigned so that a heavy downpour fills a planted median instead of a basement. This isn't demolition. Nobody is tearing every street in China up overnight. It's something slower and stranger. A country rebuilding the surface of its cities piece by piece so that when the rain comes, the city doesn't fight it. It absorbs it. The pace of this rebuilding is genuinely unusual. New construction projects across dozens of cities are now required to include these absorbing features by default, the same way a building code might require a certain number of fire exits. Older neighborhoods get retrofitted more slowly, block by block, as budgets and construction schedules allow, often years after a district was first designated as part of the program. Between the two tracks, entire districts are quietly changing what they're made of, one project at a time. By 2030, the government wants 80% of urban land in China built this way. As of now, dozens of cities are already trying, with hundreds of billions of dollars already spent chasing that goal. The idea has even reached classrooms. Some Chinese schools now teach kids about sponge cities directly, with lesson plans and activities built around the concept, the same way schools elsewhere might teach recycling or composting. That's not a minor detail. It tells you this was never meant to be a quiet engineering fix tucked away underground. It was built to be something the public understands and expects, city by city, for decades to come. The city wasn't supposed to fight the water, it was supposed to drink it. For decades, China built its cities the exact same way almost every fast-growing city on Earth did. Pave everything, drain the water away as fast as possible. Hope the pipes are big enough. If you like stories about engineering ideas nobody else was willing to try at this scale, hit subscribe, because this one gets more surprising the deeper you go. Here's the problem with that approach, and it isn't unique to China. Every square mile of soil you cover in concrete is a square mile that used to soak up rain and now sheds it instead, all at once, straight into the nearest street. Between 2008 and 2010 alone, more than 130 Chinese cities flooded 3 or more times in a single year. Dozens of them stayed flooded for over 12 hours at a stretch. Traditional drainage systems are built around one number, how much rain they're designed to handle per hour. Go even a little past that number, and the system doesn't slow down gracefully. It fails completely, all over the city, within minutes. There's no partial credit with a drainage pipe. It either carries the water away or it doesn't, and there's no middle setting between working fine and overwhelmed. And the storms testing that number keep getting worse. Faster urban growth means more concrete every single year. A warmer atmosphere means rainstorms are getting heavier and more sudden, not gentler. The gap between what the old pipes were built for and what the sky is actually delivering keeps widening, and pouring concrete faster was never going to close it. This problem is only going to get bigger too, and not just in China. The United Nations projects that 70% of the world's population will live in cities by 2050, which means more pavement, more rooftops, and more of exactly the kind of impervious surface that turns an ordinary rainstorm into an urban flood. Whatever China figures out here, or fails to figure out, is a preview of a problem every growing city on the planet is going to run into eventually. The current fix for this is what almost every city on Earth still relies on: bigger and bigger networks of underground pipes, all racing to move water away from the surface before it can pool. That works fine, right up until a storm exceeds what the pipes were sized for, and then the entire system fails at once, with nowhere for the excess water to go except the street, the subway, or someone's living room. That failure mode isn't rare either. A flooded street closes businesses for days. A flooded subway can trap and kill people who had no way to see the danger coming until the water was already at their knees. A flooded hospital can lose power and put patients in the middle of a treatment at real risk. None of these outcomes are hypothetical. Every one of them has already happened in a Chinese city in the last 2 decades, sometimes more than once in the same place. And each time it happens, it's rarely the storm itself that gets the blame in the aftermath. It's the infrastructure underneath the city that everyone assumed would simply hold. So ask yourself something simple. What if the city wasn't built to fight the water at all? What if, instead of racing to drain it away before it can do damage, the city was built to hold onto it instead, the way soil holds rain before it ever reaches a river? That idea has a name in China now, and it's already being tested at a scale nobody else on Earth has attempted. There's a name behind this whole idea, and it belongs to one man, Kongjian, a landscape architect who runs the design school at Peking University and founded a firm called Turinscape. His entire philosophy comes down to one blunt line he's repeated for years: trying to protect a city with hard gray infrastructure, meaning concrete walls, pipes, and drains, is doomed to fail. Yu built his reputation designing projects that worked with existing rivers and floodplains instead of channeling them into concrete, turning stretches of Chinese cities that used to flood every year into public parks that are actually designed to flood safely, absorbing the excess water instead of resisting it. That body of work is what caught the attention of officials looking for an alternative after the drainage system in China's own capital failed catastrophically, and it's part of why the policy that followed leaned so heavily on parks, wetlands, and green space rather than simply upgrading the existing pipe network. Think about why that's true. A concrete drainage system is a wall built against water. It works perfectly, right up until the water shows up faster than the wall can handle, and then it fails all at once, with nothing in between. There's no gradual warning stage where a pipe network starts struggling a little and gives engineers time to react. It's either moving the water away as designed, or it's overwhelmed completely, and the difference between those two states can be a matter of minutes during a truly severe storm. Yu's argument was that cities needed to stop treating water like an enemy to be blocked, and start treating it like a guest to be absorbed. The moment that turned this from a design philosophy into national policy happened in 2012. A storm hit Beijing so hard it killed 79 people in a single day, flooded major highways into the capital, and caused billions of yen in damage in a city that was supposed to have some of the best infrastructure in the country. That kind of death toll in the country's own capital forced a question nobody in government could avoid anymore. If the drainage system in Beijing itself couldn't handle a storm like that, what happens when the next one hits a city with worse infrastructure? 3 years later, in 2015, the answer came down from the top. China's State Council issued a national policy built entirely around Yu's core idea, giving it an official name, Sponge City. The goal was specific and enormous. 70% of the rain that falls on a city should be captured and reused right where it lands, not rushed into a drain and out to sea. And that standard should apply to 80% of all urban land in the country by 2030. To be fair, the underlying idea wasn't invented in China from scratch. Cities in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia had already been experimenting with smaller versions of the same concept for years, under names like low-impact development or sustainable urban drainage. What made China's version different wasn't the concept, it was the scale and the speed at which an entire government turned a design philosophy into binding national policy. 16 cities were picked first, in 2015. 14 more joined the following year, bringing the first wave to 30 cities total, each one testing the same basic bet, that a city built to soak up water beats a city built to outrun it. Choosing 30 different cities to test the idea on wasn't an accident either. China's climate varies enormously from north to south and coast to interior, so a solution that worked in a dry northern city wouldn't automatically translate to a humid, storm-prone southern one. A city near the Gobi Desert deals with rare but occasionally violent downpours on parched ground that barely absorbs water at all. A subtropical coastal city deals with near-constant heavy rainfall for months at a stretch, on ground that's often already saturated long before a major storm even arrives. Spreading the pilot program across that range of conditions was the only way to find out whether the underlying idea actually held up everywhere, or only in the places it happened to be tested first. That bet is now the most expensive urban experiment on the planet. Every one of those 30 original cities has spent the years since 2015 finding out exactly how their local geography, their local storms, and their local budgets interact with an idea that was designed to work everywhere at once, whether or not any single city was actually ready for it. The sponge toolkit starts with the pavement itself, because it's the most literal version of the idea. Ordinary asphalt is essentially a raincoat over the ground, built to shed water, not absorb it. Permeable pavement flips that completely. It's mixed with coarser material and fewer fine particles, leaving tiny gaps throughout the surface, then laid over a bed of gravel that acts like a sponge underneath it. Rain sinks straight through the surface and into that gravel layer, the same way water disappears into a sponge instead of pooling on a plate, and it either soaks slowly into the soil below or gets carried off through a slower, gentler drainage path instead of flooding the surface all at once. Rooftops get the same treatment. A green roof replaces bare tile or metal with a shallow layer of soil and low plants, which soaks up a portion of every rainstorm before it ever reaches a gutter. Multiply that across a city with millions of rooftops, and you're talking about an enormous amount of rain that simply never makes it to street level at all. Then there are rain gardens, shallow, planted dips built into parks, medians, and parking lots, designed to fill up during a storm and slowly release that water into the ground over the following hours instead of the following minutes. And in some cities, engineers have gone further still, tearing out sections of channelized, concrete-lined rivers and rebuilding the original marshes and floodplains that used to line their banks before anyone paved over them. None of these pieces work alone. A single green roof or one rain garden barely registers against a citywide storm. The entire strategy depends on stacking dozens of small absorbing surfaces across an entire district so that no single point in the city ever has to handle the full force of the rain by itself. There's a side benefit to all this greenery too, beyond just flood control. Researchers studying newly built sponge city neighborhoods have found that, over a 30-year lifespan, the plants and soil involved can offset a meaningful share of the extra carbon produced during construction, in some cases reaching a full carbon-neutral balance within 2 to 3 decades. Absorbing rain and pulling in carbon turn out to be two jobs the same patch of soil and plants can do at once. The numbers behind the bet. The scale of the money involved is what turns this from a nice idea into something historic. Estimates put the total investment needed to hit the national target at around 1.6 trillion yuan, somewhere close to $232 billion. The central government kicked in seed funding for each pilot city, typically between 400 million and 1.8 billion yuan, but that only ever covered a small slice of the real cost. Local governments and private investors were expected to cover the rest. And the rest is not small. Independent estimates put the true cost of retrofitting a single square kilometer of city at somewhere between 100 million and 150 million yuan. Multiply that across enough cities to cover 80% of urban China by 2030, and you start to understand why this is described as one of the most ambitious infrastructure programs on the planet, not just an environmental initiative with a clever name. For comparison, that per square kilometer cost is roughly what it takes to build a modest stretch of urban highway. Except instead of a highway, a city gets rainwater storage, cleaner runoff, and green space all bundled into the same investment. The rollout has kept expanding too. What started as 30 pilot cities in 2015 and 2016 grew into a full nationwide push by 2021, and today more than 60 cities carry the official Model City designation, selected across 3 separate rounds. Paying for all of this turned out to be its own engineering problem. Unlike a toll road or a water utility, a permeable parking lot or a restored wetland doesn't generate revenue on its own, which makes it a hard sell to private investors looking for a return. Local governments have had to experiment with tools like green bonds and new fee structures just to keep the money flowing once the initial central government grants ran out. And getting that financing right has proven just as difficult as getting the engineering right. That financing gap matters more than it might sound like it should. A road or a bridge charges tolls. A water utility bills customers every month. A rain garden does neither. It just sits there, quietly doing its job during every storm without ever generating a cent on its own. That makes it a genuinely hard thing to convince a private investor to fund, no matter how well it performs, which is exactly why so much of this program has had to rely on government money instead of the private capital that usually funds large infrastructure elsewhere in the world. Proof it sometimes works. The honest place to look for real evidence isn't a press release. It's a city that hit its own numbers and can show it. Chongqing is the clearest case. Following a strategy of pairing one national pilot zone with 3 separate municipal pilot districts, the city had converted 421 square kilometers of its urban area, about 24% of the total, into sponge-compliant land by 2020, clearing the national 20% target ahead of its own deadline. The city's next goal under its current 5-year plan is 45% by 2025. That's real, measurable progress, and it's worth taking seriously precisely because the story doesn't end there. Other cities in the program have posted similar, smaller wins. Expanded wetland parks that visibly hold standing water during storms that used to flood nearby streets, and neighborhoods where permeable pavement has measurably cut the volume of runoff reaching the storm drains during moderate rain. None of these local successes guarantee the national target gets hit by 2030, but they're the clearest evidence that the underlying engineering genuinely works when it's built and maintained properly. Here's what actually makes this bet historic, and it isn't the size of the check China wrote. It's the assumption sitting underneath the entire program, that water was never really the enemy, the concrete was. Every city on Earth that grew fast in the last century made the same trade without ever really deciding to. Pave the ground, and you get roads, parking, and buildings. You also delete the ground's oldest job, soaking up rain before it becomes a flood. China is the first country to try reversing that trade at national scale, on purpose, city by city, instead of just building bigger pipes and hoping the math keeps working. Other countries have tried versions of this same idea, and it's worth being honest about how much smaller those efforts are. Singapore's version, called ABC Waters, covers a little over 200 square kilometers of one city-state. Copenhagen built its own version after a single catastrophic storm in 2011, a roughly 1.3 billion euro plan covering one city. Both are real, serious, well-regarded programs. Neither one comes close to 60 cities and hundreds of billions of dollars spread across an entire country on a fixed national deadline. It's also worth noticing what these smaller international examples got right that's worth learning from. Copenhagen's plan didn't rely purely on green infrastructure. It paired parks designed to flood safely with massive underground tunnels built specifically to store and redirect the worst of a storm, treating gray and green infrastructure as partners instead of picking one over the other. China's program leans further toward the green, absorbing side of that partnership, which is exactly the design choice being tested against the biggest storms the country can throw at it, for better or worse. No other country has attempted this at anywhere near this scale. 60 cities, hundreds of billions of dollars. A single design philosophy from one architect turned into binding national policy within 3 years of a deadly flood. That's not a drainage upgrade. That's a bet that an entire nation's cities can be rebuilt to behave like the landscape they replaced. Think about how unusual that actually is for a government to attempt. Most infrastructure decisions get made project by project, city by city, with no single unifying idea behind them. This is the opposite. One philosophy tested at the scale of an entire country with a fixed national deadline attached to it. There's no equivalent anywhere else on Earth, in any sector at this size, and no other government has staked its own credibility on a single design philosophy quite this publicly. It's also a bet with an unusually public scoreboard. Unlike most government infrastructure spending, which tends to disappear into budgets nobody outside government ever reads closely, sponge city targets are specific, dated, and measured city by city. 80% by 2030 is either hit or it isn't, and every pilot city's progress toward that number is something researchers, journalists, and residents can actually check. That kind of transparency cuts both ways. It makes genuine wins like Chongqing's easy to verify, and it makes genuine failures just as hard to hide. In July 2021, that bet ran headfirst into the worst storm Zhengzhou had ever recorded. Zhengzhou had been a sponge city pilot since 2016. The city had invested more than $80 million into green infrastructure specifically meant to prevent exactly this kind of disaster over the years that followed. None of it was ultimately enough to hold back what came next. A storm dropped nearly a year's worth of rain in 4 days, an amount of water so far beyond anything the city's engineers had planned for that officials later described it as exceeding the design standard for any metropolis in the country, sponge city or not. More than 300 people died, including 14 who drowned when floodwater poured into a subway tunnel while trains were still running through it. Kongjian, the same architect whose philosophy started this entire program, didn't dodge the failure. He argued Zhengzhou wasn't really a sponge city yet at the time of the flood, since the proportion of hard, gray infrastructure in the city was still far too high relative to the absorbing surfaces meant to offset it. He's also been direct about the concept's real limits in other interviews. Sponge cities might handle a meter or two of extra water, not 5. If the sponge city can't stop it, he said, nothing can. That's not a small caveat. Research published in a Royal Society journal found that 19 of the original 30 pilot cities have flooded again since the program began, despite being designed to handle a once-in-30-year storm event. Chongqing hit its target early. Zhengzhou, with real money and years of work behind it, still lost hundreds of people to a single storm. Both of those things are true about the same program at the same time. That's genuinely hard to sit with, and it's exactly why this story doesn't get a clean ending. A government spent hundreds of billions of dollars trying to solve one of the oldest problems in urban planning, got real, measurable wins in cities like Chongqing, and still watched hundreds of people die in a city that had been working on this exact problem for 5 straight years. None of that makes the underlying idea wrong. A sponge, no matter how well designed, still has a limit to how much water it can hold before it's simply full. The honest version of this story isn't China solved flooding or China's sponge cities failed. It's that China built something genuinely new at a scale nobody else has matched, proved parts of it work, and then watched the same design run headfirst into a storm bigger than anyone had planned for. Every city still working toward the 2030 target is now operating with that lesson sitting in the background of every planning meeting. Absorb what you reasonably can. Plan honestly for the storm that exceeds it anyway. Those two ideas aren't in conflict with each other, even though it took a tragedy in Zhengzhou to make that distinction impossible to ignore. The cities that internalize that lesson properly will likely be the ones that come closest to hitting the 2030 target without another Zhengzhou along the way. The ones that treat sponge features as a box to check rather than a genuine substitute for honest risk planning are the ones most likely to be tested by the next storm that exceeds every number anyone planned for. What China has actually built isn't a finished solution. It's the largest live experiment in the world, testing whether a city can behave like a landscape again, running at a scale that will keep generating both real wins and real disasters as the climate keeps sending storms these systems were never designed to survive. The sponge either keeps up with the rain, or it doesn't. Which cities find out first? And if you liked this video, let us know by leaving a like.